face. Garrett watched the last ember in the fireplace surrender its glow, painting amber light across the stranger's cheekbones. She sat 3 feet away, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding pieces together, her designer coat worth more than his truck, now clinging to her skin, heavy with melted snow. A thin line of dried blood traced down her temple. Her fingers trembled against the cashmere, and he noticed her knuckles had gone white. Outside, the blizzard howled like something wounded and angry, rattling the windows of his small cabin. He hadn't touched a woman in 3 years, not since the hospital room, not since he'd kissed his wife's cold forehead and walked out into a world that never felt warm again. He'd told himself his daughter was enough. He'd told himself his heart had frozen shut for good, buried somewhere beneath the snow that never seemed to melt. Then she looked at him. Those dark eyes caught the dying firelight, and in them he recognized something that made his chest tighten. The same hollow ache, the same desperate loneliness he saw in his own reflection every morning while his little girl still slept. "We'll have to keep each other warm," she whispered. 5 words. Exposed skin. The space between them suddenly felt like both an ocean and a single breath. That's all it took to crack 3 years of ice. But neither of them knew yet. The storm raging outside was nothing compared to what waited when the snow finally melted. 12 hours earlier, the morning had started with pancakes shaped like stars. Garrett stood at the stove in his mother-in-law's kitchen, watching the batter bubble while Phoebe sat at the table behind him, swinging her legs that still couldn't reach the floor. She was 8 years old, with her mother's honey-colored hair and her father's stubborn chin, and she was telling him for the 3rd time that she didn't want him to go. He flipped the pancake, golden and perfect, and slid it onto her plate without turning around. The forecast had been clear. A major snowstorm moving in from the northwest, expected to hit the mountain by late afternoon. His homestay cabin up there had guests checking in next week, and he needed to secure the shutters, check the generator, make sure the pipes wouldn't freeze. "But what if you get stuck?" Phoebe asked, dragging her fork through the syrup in slow, worried circles. Garrett finally turned to look at her, and something in his chest pulled tight the way it always did when she wore that expression. She had learned too young that people who left didn't always come back. He crouched down beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Her skin was warm from sleep, still carrying that soft, little kid smell that he knew wouldn't last forever. He promised her he'd be back before dinner, before bedtime stories, before the nightlight clicked on in her room. He promised her the way he'd promised 1,000 times before, and she nodded, accepting it the way children accept gravity, completely, until the day it fails them. The drive up the mountain took 2 hours on roads that wound through pine forests, heavy with the first dusting of snow. Garrett's truck was old, a 1994 Ford that had belonged to his father, and it groaned on the steep inclines, but never quit. He kept the radio off, preferring the silence, the white noise of tires on asphalt, and wind cutting through the trees. The cabin came into view around the last bend, a modest A-frame structure he'd built with his own hands 5 years ago, back when his wife was still alive, and they dreamed of filling it with summer guests and winter laughter. Now it paid the bills. Now it was just wood and nails and windows that needed checking before the storm. He spent the afternoon working. The methodical tasks soothed something in him, hammering shutters into place, testing the backup generator, draining the outdoor pipes. His hands moved with the muscle memory of a man who had learned to fill silence with labor. By 4 o'clock, the sky had turned the color of wet cement, and the first real snowflakes began to fall. They came down fat and slow at first, almost lazy. But Garrett had lived in these mountains long enough to read the weather like a language. This storm would be bad. He loaded his tools into the truck bed, checked his phone, One bar of signal, a text from Phoebe that was just a string of heart emojis, and started the engine. The road down the mountain was already slick. Garrett drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, headlights cutting pale tunnels through the thickening snow. He was thinking about Phoebe, about the way she'd looked at him that morning, about the bedtime story he'd promised to read, the one about the princess who saved herself. He was thinking about his wife, the way he always did when he drove alone, remembering how she used to rest her hand on his thigh during long trips, how her voice sounded when she sang along to songs she didn't know the words to. He was thinking about heat and home, and the particular weight of a sleeping child carried from car to bed. That's when he saw the car. It had gone off the road about a mile past the old logging turnoff, rear wheels hanging over the drainage ditch, hood crumpled against a pine tree trunk. The Mercedes was silver, expensive, completely wrong for these roads in this weather. Garrett pulled over, killed the engine, and stepped out into the biting cold. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating on his shoulders as he approached the wreck. Through the driver's side window, he could see a woman slumped against the steering wheel, dark hair spilling across her face. For one terrible moment, he thought she was dead, thought the universe had decided to show him another body, another loss, another reason to stop believing in anything good. Then she moved. Her head lifted slowly, and she turned to look at him through the glass with eyes that were dazed but alive. Blood ran from a cut on her forehead, bright red against pale skin, and her lips were moving, forming words he couldn't hear. Garrett wrenched open the door, and the cold rushed in, and he reached for her without thinking. The first time in 3 years, his hands had moved toward a woman with something other than the polite distance he'd cultivated like armor. She was shaking. Her fingers closed around his wrist, grip surprisingly strong, and she said something about ice, about the curve, about not seeing it until too late. He helped her out of the car, one arm around her waist, and she leaned into him heavily. She was tall, slender, wearing clothes that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage. A cream-colored cashmere coat, now stained with blood, heels completely useless in 4 inches of snow. Her perfume cut through the cold air, something expensive and complicated, and up close he could see that she was beautiful in that sharp, untouchable way that usually made him feel like a trespasser just for looking. But her eyes were wide with shock, and her body trembled against his, and in that moment, she was just a person who needed help. Just a human being, fragile and afraid, and he knew exactly how that felt. The storm made the decision for them. By the time Garrett got her into his truck, the visibility had dropped to nearly nothing, a wall of white in every direction. The road ahead invisible. He tried his phone. No signal. He tried the radio. Static. The woman beside him was shivering violently now, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear them over the wind. Her name, she managed to tell him between shudders, was Sloane. Sloane Whitfield. The name meant nothing to him then. He didn't read business magazines or follow corporate news. But he would learn later that she ran a company worth more than the entire town where he'd grown up. "We can't make it down," he said, more to himself than to her. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the snow, and he could feel the tires slipping even at a crawl. "I've got a cabin about a mile back. We'll have to wait out the storm there." She nodded, too cold or too dazed to argue, and he turned the truck around. The drive back felt longer than it should have. The familiar road transformed into something alien and hostile by the blizzard. Twice he felt the back-end fishtail. Twice he corrected with the calm precision of a man who had grown up driving these mountains. Sloane sat rigid beside him, one hand braced against the dashboard, the other pressed against the wound on her head. The cabin emerged from the white chaos like a ghost taking solid form. Garrett helped her inside, guided her to the couch near the fireplace, and immediately began building a fire. His hands moved automatically, kindling, then smaller logs, Then the steady pyramid that would burn for hours, while she sat motionless, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. The fire caught, grew, began throwing heat into the room, and some of the tension bled out of her shoulders. He found the first aid kit in the bathroom, the one his wife had insisted they keep stocked, and cleaned the cut on Sloane's forehead with hands that were gentle despite their calluses. "You should go to a hospital," he said, pressing a butterfly bandage over the wound. "When the storm clears." She laughed at that, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. "I was supposed to be at a hospital 12 hours ago," she said. "Well, a church first, then a hospital for the psychiatric evaluation my mother would have demanded." He didn't understand, and his confusion must have shown on his face, because she smiled then. A real smile, small and tired, but genuine. "I was getting married today," she explained. "Or I was supposed to be. I got in my car 6 hours before the ceremony and just drove. I didn't even know where I was going until I ended up here." Garrett sat back on his heels, studying her. In the firelight, she looked less like a magazine photograph and more like a person. The mascara smudged beneath her eyes, the careful hairstyle falling apart, the expensive clothes wrinkled and stained. She had run from her own wedding, driven into a snowstorm in heels and cashmere, crashed her car on a mountain road, and now she was sitting in a stranger's cabin, while the world outside tried to bury them both. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to know what kind of life a person had to be running from to end up here, like this, with blood on her face and snow melting in her hair. But he had learned, in the 3 years since his wife died, that some questions were too heavy to ask out loud. Instead, he stood up and walked to the kitchen. "Are you hungry?" he asked, already pulling a pot from the cabinet. She stared at him for a long moment, like he'd asked her something impossible, something no one had thought to ask in years. Then she nodded, and something in her eyes softened, a crack in the ice, barely visible but there. The soup was simple: chicken broth, vegetables from a can, noodles he found in the back of the pantry. He made it the way he made it for Phoebe when she was sick, adding extra carrots because kids needed vitamins, then remembering that the woman on his couch was not a child and probably hadn't eaten canned soup in decades. But when he handed her the bowl, she wrapped both hands around it like it was precious, and she ate every bite without complaint. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls, and the windows rattled in their frames, and the snow kept falling like it would never stop. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, and 2 strangers sat in its warmth, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. The power went out just before midnight. One moment the lamps were glowing soft and yellow. The next they were gone, leaving only the fire's wavering light. Garrett found candles in the kitchen drawer, lit them with matches from the mantel, placed them around the room like small offerings against the dark. Sloane had changed out of her ruined coat. He'd given her a flannel shirt and a pair of sweatpants that had belonged to his wife, still folded in the dresser where he couldn't bring himself to move them. The clothes hung loose on her frame, and something about seeing her in them made his throat tight in a way he didn't want to examine. They talked. It started slowly, the way conversations do between strangers who have nowhere else to be. Surface things first, careful things. She asked about the cabin, and he told her about building it, about the summers he and his wife had spent hammering and painting and dreaming. She asked about his daughter, and his voice changed when he spoke about Phoebe, became warmer, softer, full of a love so obvious it seemed to fill the room. Sloane listened with her head tilted slightly, watching his face in the candlelight, and he saw something flicker in her expression. Curiosity, maybe, or hunger, the kind that had nothing to do with food. "Why did you run?" he finally asked. The question had been sitting between them for hours, patient and heavy, and he couldn't hold it back anymore. Sloane was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. And when she spoke, her voice was different, lower, rougher, like the words had to claw their way out. "Because I woke up this morning and realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone asked me what I wanted," she said. "Not what was best for the company, not what would make the shareholders happy, not what my mother expected or my fiancé required, just what I wanted. And I didn't have an answer. I've built an empire, and I couldn't remember what it felt like to want something for myself." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Garrett thought about his wife, about the way she used to ask him every night what the best part of his day was. He thought about Phoebe asking him to read just one more story, about the weight of her head against his shoulder when she fell asleep. He thought about want and need, and the difference between them. "What do you want now?" he asked. Sloane turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright with something. Tears, maybe, or just the firelight reflecting. "I don't know," she whispered. "But this is the first time in years that the not knowing doesn't feel like failure." The temperature kept dropping. Garrett added the last of the logs to the fire, but it wasn't enough. The cold seeped through the walls, through the floor, through the gaps in the old windows he'd meant to replace last summer. He found every blanket in the cabin, piled them on the couch, but still Sloane shivered. Her fingers had gone pale, and her lips were starting to turn blue at the edges, and he knew that hypothermia didn't care about propriety or the careful distance he'd maintained for 3 years. She must have known it too, because when she looked at him, there was no calculation in her eyes, just cold and exhaustion, and the simple animal need for warmth. "We'll have to keep each other warm," she whispered. The words hung in the air between them. Garrett felt something shift in his chest, fear maybe, or anticipation, or the first stirring of a feeling he'd thought he'd buried with his wife. He sat down beside her, close enough to feel the cold radiating from her skin, and after a moment's hesitation, she leaned into him. Her head found the hollow of his shoulder. Her hair smelled like snow and something floral, fading perfume mixed with wood smoke. He pulled the blanket around them both and tried to remember how to breathe. They didn't speak. Words would have broken something fragile, something that was building between them in the silence. Her body slowly warmed against his, and her shivering gradually stilled. And at some point, her breathing deepened into sleep. Garrett stayed awake, watching the fire die down to embers, feeling the rise and fall of her chest against his side. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the cabin, in the small circle of warmth they'd created together, something new was taking shape. Something he hadn't expected. Something that terrified him more than the blizzard ever could. He thought about Phoebe, safe and warm at her grandmother's house, probably sleeping now with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. He thought about his wife, about the last words she'd said to him. "Don't let your heart freeze, Garrett. Promise me." And how he'd broken that promise every day for 3 years. He thought about the woman in his arms, this stranger who had crashed into his life literally and figuratively, who ran from her own wedding and ended up in his cabin by something that felt like fate, but was probably just weather. And for the first time since the hospital room, since the funeral, since the long gray months of learning how to be alone, he wondered if his heart might not be as frozen as he'd thought. Morning came slowly, the gray light seeping through the windows like something cautious. The storm had stopped. Outside, the world was white and still, buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, and the silence was so complete it felt sacred. Sloane stirred against him, and her eyes opened, and for a moment they just looked at each other. This man and this woman, who had been strangers yesterday, who had shared warmth through the night, who had somehow crossed a threshold that neither of them fully understood. Then she pulled back, and the distance returned to her eyes, and the spell broke like thin ice under too much weight. Reality arrived with cell phone signals. The moment Sloane's phone found service, it began buzzing with a violence that seemed almost personal. Notification after notification, voicemail after voicemail, the accumulated urgency of a life she'd tried to leave behind. Garrett watched her face change as she scrolled through the messages, watched the softness from the night before harden into something sharp and guarded. The woman who had fallen asleep against his shoulder was gone. In her place stood the CEO, the one who ran an empire, and the transformation was so complete it made him doubt his own memories. 18 missed calls from my COO, she said, her voice clipped and professional. 12 from my mother. 23 from... She paused, and something flickered across her face. Guilt, maybe, or resignation. From the man I was supposed to marry. Garrett nodded, unsure what to say. The fire had died completely now, leaving only cold ash, and the cabin felt emptier than it had before. He busied himself with making coffee, grateful for something to do with his hands, while she paced the small living room with the phone pressed to her ear. He couldn't help but overhear pieces of her conversation, fragments of a life so different from his own it might as well have been another planet. Stock prices, board meetings, a partnership agreement that would collapse if she didn't return immediately. And underneath it all, a man's voice on the other end, angry and wounded, demanding explanations she didn't seem willing to give. "I understand that, Harrison," she said at one point, and her voice was ice. "I understand perfectly. But I'm not discussing this over the phone, and I'm not making any promises until I can think clearly." She hung up, and for a moment she stood perfectly still, staring at the blank screen. Garrett handed her a cup of coffee, and she took it without looking at him. The space between them felt different now, charged with something uncomfortable, something that hadn't been there in the darkness. He wondered if she was embarrassed by the intimacy they'd shared, if she was already constructing the narrative that would make last night into nothing more than a survival necessity. Part of him wanted to say something, to acknowledge what had passed between them, but another part, the part that had learned to protect itself through 3 years of grief, counseled silence. "The roads won't be clear until this afternoon," he said instead. "Practical. Safe. Rescue crews will probably start making their way up by noon." She nodded, still not meeting his eyes. "I need to get back," she said, and the words sounded like an apology, or maybe a warning. "There's a situation at my company. 200 people could lose their jobs if I don't." She trailed off, and for just a second, the mask slipped, and he saw the exhaustion beneath it, the weight of all those lives resting on her shoulders, the impossible pressure of being the one who had to save everyone. Garrett understood something in that moment. He understood that her armor wasn't so different from his own, just built of different materials. He had used grief and solitude to protect himself from feeling too much. She had used success and control. They were both hiding, just in different directions. "Then you should go," he said quietly. "When the road's clear. You should go back and do what you need to do." The words cost him something, but he said them anyway, because it was the right thing, because he had a daughter waiting for him, and she had an empire to save, because the night was over, and the storm had passed, and real life didn't care about what happened in the space between darkness and dawn. She finally looked at him then, really looked, and her eyes were bright with something he couldn't name. "Last night," she started, then stopped. "I don't usually. I've never..." She was fumbling for words. This woman who probably delivered boardroom speeches without blinking, and the vulnerability in her confusion made his chest ache. "Thank you," she finally said, "for finding me. For the soup. For..." She gestured vaguely at the cold fireplace, at the blankets still tangled on the couch, at the impossible intimacy of 2 strangers who had kept each other alive through the night. He nodded, accepting her thanks, letting her reduce what had happened to gratitude, because it was easier that way. Outside, the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, and the snow glittered like diamonds scattered across an endless white field. It was beautiful. It was the kind of beauty that made him think of beginnings, of fresh starts, of pages not yet written. But he had learned not to trust that kind of beauty. He had learned that the world could be breathtaking and brutal in the same moment, that sunlight after a storm didn't promise anything except more weather to come. The sound of his phone broke the silence. Phoebe's ringtone, the one she'd programmed herself, a ridiculous pop song that always made him smile. He answered it quickly, and her voice came through bright and worried, asking if he was okay, if he was coming home, if he'd gotten stuck in the snow. He told her yes, he was fine. He'd be there soon, and he heard her exhale with relief. "I made you a picture," she said. "It's us building a snowman. Grandma said we could build a real one when you get back." He promised her they would, promised her hot chocolate after, promised her everything he had to give because that was what fathers did. They made promises, and they kept them, no matter what. When he hung up, Sloane was watching him with an expression that made something twist in his stomach. "You have a daughter," she said, like she was remembering it for the first time, like the reality of it was settling over her, in a new way. "Phoebe," he said. "She's 8. Sloane nodded slowly, and whatever had been softening in her face seemed to harden again, resolve building like walls going up brick by brick. "You should get back to her," she said, and her voice was gentle but firm. "She needs you. That's something real, something that matters." The rescue vehicles arrived just after 1 o'clock, a county plow followed by a tow truck for what remained of her Mercedes. Garrett watched Sloane gather her things, watched her step out into the blinding white world, watched her pause at the door and turn back to look at him one last time. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something important, something that might change things, but then she closed it again and just nodded. A small gesture. A goodbye that wasn't quite goodbye, but wasn't anything else either. He gave her his number before she left, wrote it on the back of an old receipt, pressed it into her hand without explanation. She took it, tucked it into her pocket, and walked out into the snow. He stood at the window and watched the tow truck pull away, watched until it disappeared around the bend, watched until the only evidence she'd ever been there was a faint impression of tire tracks that the wind was already beginning to erase. The drive down the mountain felt longer than it should have. Garrett kept both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the night, analyzing every word, every glance, every moment where something had passed between them that he couldn't quite name. He thought about the way she'd looked at him in the firelight. He thought about the weight of her body against his, the trust implicit in falling asleep in a stranger's arms. He thought about the way she'd hardened the moment her phone came alive, the walls going up so fast he'd almost believed they'd never been down at all. Phoebe launched herself at him the moment he walked through her grandmother's door, small arms wrapping around his waist with fierce strength. "You're back!" she shouted, her voice muffled against his jacket. "You're back! You're back! You're back!" He lifted her up, held her close, breathed in the familiar smell of her shampoo and the fabric softener her grandmother used. This was real. This was what mattered. This small person who needed him, who trusted him, who loved him with the uncomplicated totality that only children could manage. His mother-in-law, Helen, watched from the kitchen doorway with knowing eyes. She was 72 years old, sharp as a tack, and she had raised 4 children of her own before losing her daughter to cancer. She knew things. She saw things. And right now, she was seeing something in his face that made her tilt her head and purse her lips in that particular way she had. "You look tired," she said, which wasn't what she meant at all. "Storm was bad," he replied, which wasn't what he meant either. They had always communicated like this, in subtext, in implications, in the spaces between words. That night, after Phoebe was asleep with her stuffed rabbit and her nightlight and his promise to build a snowman first thing in the morning, Garrett sat alone in the living room of his small house and stared at his phone. He had Sloane's number. She'd taken his, but she'd also given hers, scrawled on the same receipt in handwriting that was surprisingly messy for someone so put together. He could call her. He could check if she'd made it back safely, if she'd saved her company, if she'd talked to the fiancé whose voice he'd heard through the phone. He could ask if last night had meant anything, or if it was already fading into the category of things that happened during snowstorms and were best forgotten. He didn't call. He put the phone down and went to bed, and he dreamed about fire and snow and dark eyes that held too much sadness for someone so young. In the morning, he built a snowman with Phoebe, and they gave it a carrot nose and button eyes and a scarf that had belonged to his wife. Phoebe laughed and threw snowballs and demanded hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, and he gave her everything she asked for because she was his daughter, and he loved her, and that was supposed to be enough. It had been enough for 3 years. He didn't understand why it suddenly felt like something was missing. A week passed, then 2. The snow began to melt, slowly at first, then faster as the temperatures climbed towards something almost resembling spring. Garrett went back to work, carpentry jobs mostly, fixing things for neighbors who knew he was good with his hands and needed the money. He took Phoebe to school and picked her up, made her lunches with the crusts cut off, helped her with homework he barely understood. Life continued in its ordinary patterns, and he told himself that was good. That was right. That ordinary was what he'd been fighting for ever since his world had fallen apart. But sometimes, late at night, he found himself thinking about Sloane, wondering where she was, what she was doing, whether she'd put her empire back together or let it crumble. Wondering if she ever thought about the cabin, about the night, about him. He didn't let himself wonder for too long. He had practice at that, at shutting doors in his mind, at filing things away under things that don't matter, even when they did. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon that felt like any other Tuesday afternoon, his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway, because that was what you did when you ran a business, even a small one. "Is this Garrett?" The voice was familiar, low, a little hesitant, nothing like the commanding tone he'd heard her use on the phone during the storm. "Sloane?" He said her name like a question, like he wasn't sure she was real. There was a pause on the other end, a breath that might have been a laugh or a sigh. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me," she said, and something in her voice made him think she'd been more afraid that he would. She came back on the first real day of spring. The snow had retreated to shadowy patches beneath the trees, and the first green shoots were pushing through the mud. And the air smelled like earth and possibility. Garrett was on the porch of his cabin. He'd come up to do some repairs, to get it ready for the season's first guests, when he heard the car engine. He knew, somehow, before he even looked. He knew by the way his heart started beating faster, by the way his hands suddenly didn't know what to do with themselves, by the way the air seemed to change and thicken with anticipation. It was a different car than before. A sensible SUV instead of a Mercedes, something that could actually handle mountain roads. Sloane stepped out wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her hair down around her shoulders, and she looked nothing like the woman who had crashed into his life 2 months ago. She looked softer, younger, less like someone carrying the weight of an empire, and more like someone who had finally set part of that weight down. "I booked the cabin," she said, stopping a few feet away from the porch. For a week, he stared at her, trying to process. "You drove all the way up here to tell me you booked my cabin?" A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, the first real smile he'd seen from her, unguarded, and almost shy. "I drove all the way up here because I couldn't stop thinking about chicken soup from a can," she said, "and flannel shirts that smell like wood smoke, and a man who didn't ask me to be anything other than cold and tired and human." Garrett came down the porch steps slowly, closing the distance between them one careful footfall at a time. Up close, he could see the changes in her, subtle things. The kind you'd only notice if you'd spent a long night memorizing someone's face by firelight. She looked rested. She looked present. She looked like someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it. "What happened to your company?" he asked. "What happened to the 200 jobs?" "I found another solution," she said. "One that didn't require me to sell my soul. It took some time, some difficult conversations, a lot of sleepless nights. But it's handled." She paused, and something flickered in her eyes. "I also ended things with Harrison. For real this time. Told him the truth. That I'd spent my whole life building things that other people wanted, and I was done. That I wanted to figure out what I wanted, even if it took me years. Even if I had to start from scratch." The space between them felt charged, electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. Garrett wanted to reach for her, wanted to touch her face, wanted to know if her skin was as warm as he remembered. But there was something he needed to say first, something that had been building in him for 2 months of ordinary days and extraordinary thoughts. "I have a daughter," he said, and the words came out rougher than he intended. "An 8-year-old daughter who lost her mother 3 years ago and who is the center of my entire world. Whatever this is, whatever might happen between us, she comes first. Always. That's not negotiable." Sloane nodded, and her eyes were serious, understanding. "I know," she said. "That's one of the things I couldn't stop thinking about. The way you talked about her. The way your whole face changed. I've never seen anyone love like that. So completely. So unconditionally. It terrified me at first. And then it made me wonder what it would feel like to be loved that way. To love that way." The sound of another car engine broke the moment. Helen's ancient station wagon, coming up the mountain road with Phoebe's face pressed against the window. Garrett had asked them to come up for the day, thinking he'd just be doing repairs, thinking this would be an ordinary Sunday. He watched his daughter spot the unfamiliar SUV, watched her curiosity kindle, watched her tumble out of the car before it had fully stopped, because she was 8, and caution was still a foreign concept. "Daddy, who's that?" Phoebe ran toward him, all flying hair and untied shoelaces, and he caught her the way he always did, one arm scooping her up, settling her on his hip like she was still small enough for carrying. She studied Sloane with the unfiltered intensity of children, taking in the stranger's face, her clothes, the way she stood close to her father. "This is Sloane," Garrett said, and his voice was steady, even though his heart wasn't. "She's a friend. She's going to be staying at the cabin for a while." Phoebe considered this information with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. "Do you like hot chocolate?" she asked finally, which was apparently the crucial qualification. Sloane smiled, a real smile, bright and surprised, and crouched down to Phoebe's level the way Garrett had done with her 1,000 times before. "I love hot chocolate," she said, "especially with extra marshmallows." Phoebe's face split into a grin that was missing 2 front teeth and absolutely perfect. "Daddy makes the best hot chocolate," she declared. "But you have to stir it yourself, or it doesn't count." Garrett watched them, his daughter and this woman who had fallen into his life like snow, unexpected and transformative. He watched Phoebe grab Sloane's hand and tug her toward the cabin, already chattering about the snowman they'd built, and the picture she'd drawn, and the princess who saved herself. He watched Sloane let herself be led, let herself be pulled into this small, warm world that had been closed to strangers for 3 years. And he felt something shift in his chest, not the crack of ice breaking, but the slow, steady thaw of a spring that had finally arrived. Helen came up beside him, watching the same scene with eyes that had seen decades of grief and joy and everything in between. "She seems nice," she said, and the words carried layers of meaning he chose not to unpack. "She is," he replied, and that was all. That was enough. Inside the cabin, Phoebe was showing Sloane the fireplace, explaining in great detail how her daddy had built it with his own hands, how the stones came from the river at the bottom of the mountain, how the fire had kept them warm during the big storm. Garrett stood in the doorway, watching, holding this moment in his chest like something precious. The cabin looked the same as it had 2 months ago. Same wood walls, same windows, same couch where they'd huddled together against the cold. But everything felt different. Everything felt possible in a way it hadn't felt for a long time. He made hot chocolate. 3 cups, extra marshmallows in each, stirred by 3 different hands because apparently that was the rule now. They sat together by the window where the spring sunlight streamed in, warm and golden, and Phoebe talked about school and friends and a boy named Cooper who had stolen her eraser but given it back with a note that said, "Sorry," which meant he was probably okay, actually. Sloane listened like every word mattered, asked questions that made Phoebe light up with the joy of being heard, and Garrett watched them both with a heart that was beating steady and strong for the first time in 3 years. Later, when Phoebe had worn herself out and fallen asleep on the couch with her head in her father's lap, Sloane sat beside them and said, "I don't know how to do this, any of this. I've never been part of a family. I don't know the rules, the rhythms, the way things are supposed to work." Her voice was quiet, honest, vulnerable in a way that the CEO never would have allowed. Garrett reached over and took her hand, the first time he'd touched her since that night, deliberate and gentle. "Neither do I," he said. "Not anymore. But I'm willing to figure it out. If you are." She squeezed his hand. Outside, the last patches of snow glittered in the afternoon light, diamonds scattered across the mountainside. A bird sang somewhere in the pines, the first bird song of the season, tentative and sweet. Spring was here. Spring was really, finally here. And in a small cabin on a mountain, 2 people who had survived a storm sat together in the warmth, watching a little girl sleep, holding hands like teenagers, building something new from the ashes of everything they'd lost. No promises were made that day, no grand declarations, no fairy tale endings, no guarantees that everything would work out perfectly. But there was hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. There was a child's laughter echoing off wooden walls. There was the particular kind of hope that comes after winter. Fragile and fierce, impossible to predict, worth protecting with everything you have. And sometimes, that's enough. Sometimes, that's everything.